Good morning from South Dakota. We left bright and early this morning because we are actually road tripping for this episode. We started in Sioux Falls this morning and we're driving all the way across the state to Rapid City. We have a long drive with no shortage of reading time. And like any great American road trip, we have plenty of stops scheduled along the way. For the South Dakota book of this project, we are reading The Personal History of Rachel Dupree. It is a historical fiction novel set in the early 1900s during the time of the Homestead Act, when the government was trying to encourage westward expansion by basically giving out free land. So as the title would suggest, this book follows Rachel Dupree, who is an African-American woman who relocates from Chicago to the Badlands with her new husband, Isaac, in promise of a better life. But years later, they are just struggling to survive with a lack of community and lack of resources in the middle of a terrible drought. This book has often been praised for its compelling and authentic voice, as well as a vivid atmosphere, and just giving a unique and rarely heard perspective of an African-American woman in the American West. Because we're driving, I'm actually going to be alternating between the hard copy and the audiobook. I think it will be especially cool to listen to this story as we drive through this beautiful landscape, especially when we get to the Badlands, because that's where a majority of this book takes place. We are currently at our first stop, which is 1880 Town, and it's basically just like this village that replicates what a small village was like during the time of westward expansion. So that should get us into the mood for the setting of the story, and then we will get back on the road and start reading. Okay, we have made it to our next stop, the Badlands, and I'm about 100 pages into the book. So as the book begins, it alternates between Rachel's young adulthood in Chicago in contrast with her present 14 years later when she's in the Badlands. One thing I noticed right away was the contrast between Rachel's strength and independence in the present day against the choices that she made in her youth. In the flashbacks, she's so young and naive. All she wants is to get married and find a man because that was considered success for women in those days. She's working at a boarding house in Chicago when she meets the owner's son, Isaac. And he essentially agrees to marry her in exchange for a claim to her stake of the land. I think this just says so much about the time when women's ambitions were mostly tied to the men around them and men just wanted to move up in the world. Now, years later, they're living through this brutal drought and finding that the reality of homesteading is not exactly what they were promised. What is really interesting is seeing how much both of them have changed since those early days. You can just feel the difference in their maturity, and through the flashbacks, you can kind of piece together how they got to where they are now. It adds this extra layer of tension as they try to balance the harshness of their new reality with the weight of their expectations. So far, I'm enjoying the narrative, and I'm interested to see how Rachel and Isaac navigate these new challenges. For now, we are going to take a little break and explore the Badlands in real life. Time seeing the Badlands, and it's unlike anything I've ever seen. The landscape is just so dramatic and expansive, but it also feels very isolated, and it's bringing a lot of context into the isolation that Rachel felt when she first came to this area. You can just imagine how harsh and unforgiving this land would be, especially back 100 years ago when people were trying to settle and build a new life here. You could spend days trying to see every corner of this park, but we're going to keep moving to our next stop on the itinerary, and if you've ever been to South Dakota, you have probably heard of it. Ball Drug has actually been around since 1931, so around the time that this novel was set. It's kind of turned into this iconic road trip stop, but we're going to stop by and see what all the hype is about. have made it to Rapid City, and we're a little over 200 pages into the book. I think the real strength of this book is Rachel's narrative voice. It's written in such an intimate way that it really feels like you're right inside of her thoughts. You can feel her constant sense of responsibility, the burden of caring for her family, the anxiety of another pregnancy, and just the overall strain of surviving the drought, all while her self-absorbed husband remains distant and unreliable. Everything just feels so tenuous. It really makes you understand how much strength she has just to be able to keep going. As a side note, I've been listening to the audiobook narration and it is phenomenal. It's been a very immersive experience just driving and listening to this story, especially going through the Badlands where the book is set. We have a few more stops on the list today, but we're going to take a little bit of a break from driving and explore some of the shops in downtown Rapid City. Okay, we have made it to Mount Rushmore, and that is officially the last stop on our South Dakota itinerary. So let's talk about the personal history of Rachel Dupree. So there's a lot to unpack about this book, and I think that to start, you have to look at the time in history. You are coming out of the era of the Emancipation Proclamation, and as a result, you have a lot of first and second generation African American men and women who are trying to establish themselves. So it makes sense why Isaac and Rachel have this dream of owning land and building a home, because it is something that has seemed elusive to them. And then on the other side of it, you have the Homestead Act, which displaced a lot of the Native population. So as a result, you kind of have this tension between the Native Americans and the homesteaders that is in the background throughout this whole story. I think the author does a great job at capturing the culture and attitude of this time in history through her characterizations of Isaac and Rachel and their interaction with the side characters throughout this book. Despite this perceived freedom, there is a lot of prejudice and racial tension that has a heavy influence throughout the story. I also think that the author captures the Badlands in a way that's just so true to life. You can almost feel the heat and the dust and just how harsh and isolating the atmosphere is. The drought adds this constant underlying tension, and it feels like every one of Rachel's struggles somehow circles back to the land itself. This book clearly leaves you with a lot to think about, and it's such a unique perspective into this time in history. So while it's not something I normally would have reached for, it was very enlightening and I enjoyed the writing style. Overall, I would give this 4 stars, and I would recommend it to anyone who enjoys a female-focused narrative in historical fiction. With that, we are checking South Dakota off the list, and we are now 8 states into our 50 states challenge. Thank you so much for joining me in South Dakota, and I will see you in the next state.